A GoodKnight story. In 1030 AD, on a summer day when the sun itself turned black, a deposed king returned from exile to reclaim his throne and met his death at the hands of his own people in a muddy Norwegian valley. And our silver-armored GoodKnight stood in the shield wall as 3,600 loyalists clashed with over 7,000 rebel farmers in the battle that would transform a failed tyrant into the eternal saint of Norway. As King Olaf II Haraldsson, the warrior who had torn down London Bridge and terrorized the coasts of Christendom, led his desperate herd against a peasant army that hated his taxes more than they feared his god, this wasn't just another Viking skirmish. It was the violent death of the clan-based autonomy of the Viking Age and the bloody birth of medieval monarchy in the north. Watch as our GoodKnight survives the catastrophic rout at Stiklestad, witnesses the king's martyrdom beneath a darkened sky, and lives to see the most astonishing reversal in medieval history, the man killed by his own subjects rising from a sandbank grave to become Saint Olaf, the eternal king who conquered Norway from beyond death itself. From the enchanted reindeer skin coat that turned aside the king's sword, to the blind beggar whose sight returned when he touched the royal blood, to the eclipse that froze warriors mid-strike with cosmic terror, every moment of this epic shaped the soul of a nation. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's greatest turning points, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of kings with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which moment in Viking history you'd like the GoodKnight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful day in 1030 when a king died and a saint was born. Chapter 1. The Weight of Exile. The GoodKnight had learned, over his long centuries, that exile was a particular kind of death, not the clean death of the battlefield, where a man's soul departed with his last breath, and his name lived on in the songs of skalds. No, exile was the slow suffocation of identity, the gradual erasure of purpose. It was to be a ghost among the living, a warrior without a war, a sworn man without a lord to serve. He had followed King Olaf II Haraldsson into that ghostly realm in the winter of 1028, when the silver of Knut the Great had purchased what his armies could not conquer. The chieftains of Norway, men who had once bent the knee and sworn oaths on Thor's ring and Christ's cross alike, had simply opened their purses to the Danish king's messengers and closed their doors to their own monarch. There had been no great battle, no heroic last stand, just the quiet, humiliating arithmetic of betrayal. English pennies weighed against Norwegian loyalty, and loyalty found wanting. The GoodKnight remembered the journey east with the clarity that only shame provides. They had ridden through the mountain passes as winter closed its fist around the land, a ragged column of perhaps 200 men, all that remained of the royal herd. Behind them, Norway slipped away like a dream upon waking. Ahead lay only the uncertain hospitality of foreign courts and the cold comfort of Ex's bread. King Olaf had said little during those weeks. The man who had once commanded fleets and armies, who had pulled down the bridge at London and planted the cross in the pagan groves of Trøndelag, rode in silence. His face, which the GoodKnight had seen split into fierce joy during the storm of battle, had become a mask. Only his eyes moved, constantly scanning the horizons, as if searching for something he had lost and could not name. They had found refuge in Gardariki, the land of the Rus, in the city of Novgorod, where the wooden towers rose above the bird, frozen Volkhov River, and the church bells rang with a strange eastern cadence. Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise had received them with the careful courtesy due to a fallen king. Generous enough to demonstrate Christian charity, restrained enough to avoid offending the powerful Knut. For 2 years, the GoodKnight had lived in that liminal space between honor and irrelevance. He drilled with the other exiles in the frozen courtyards. He attended the Orthodox liturgies in churches where the icons stared with golden eyes, and the priests sang in a language that twisted the familiar Latin into something both recognizable and alien. He watched King Olaf transform. The warrior king who had raided his way across the North Sea was becoming something else, something quieter, something that frightened the GoodKnight more than any berserker's charge. Olaf spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the cold stone floors until his knees bled through his trousers. He gave away his remaining silver to the Keats, poor, keeping only enough to maintain his household. He spoke often of Jerusalem, of walking the Via Dolorosa where Christ had carried the cross, of washing away his sins in the Jordan River. The other exiles whispered that the king had lost his nerve, that Exa had broken him. But the GoodKnight, who had stood at Olaf's shoulder through a dozen battles, recognized something different in the king's eyes. Not fear, not despair. Something harder and brighter, like iron heated in the forge until it glowed white. The king was not breaking. He was being reforged. The dream came in the spring of 1030. The GoodKnight was not present when Olaf woke gasping in his chamber, but he heard the story within hours. Everyone in the exile court heard it. The king claimed that his predecessor, the martyred Olaf Tryggvason, had appeared to him in a vision. Or perhaps it had been an angel. The accounts varied, but the message was clear and unambiguous. Return to Norway. Reclaim your Odal, your ancestral right. If you die in the attempt, you will be raised to a kingdom greater than any earthly throne. When the GoodKnight heard this, he felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. He knew what it meant. The king was not planning a campaign. He was planning a martyrdom. Within a week, preparations began. Olaf sent messengers to his young son Magnus, who would remain in Yaroslav's care. The boy was perhaps 5 years old, too young to understand that he might never see his father again. The GoodKnight watched the king embrace the child, saw the way Olaf's hands trembled as he touched his son's hair, and understood that whatever else the king had become, he was still a man, still a father, still capable of the particular agony that comes from choosing duty over love. They departed Novgorod in early summer, a column of perhaps 400 men. King Anund Jakob of Sweden met them at the border with promises of support and a contingent of Swedish warriors. The Swedish king feared Knut's growing power, saw in Olaf's return a chance to check Danish expansion, but he would not commit his full army to what might be a lost cause. Instead, he offered guides, provisions, and enough men to give Olaf's venture the appearance of legitimacy. The march through Sweden was a strange, dreamlike affair. They moved through the endless forests of Jämtland, where the pine trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight, and the silence was broken only by the creak of leather and the rhythmic tramp of feet. The GoodKnight marched in his accustomed place near the king's banner, his mail shirt heavy on his shoulders, his sword loose in its scabbard. As they approached the Norwegian border, the character of the army began to change. Word of the king's return spread through the forest settlements and mountain valleys. Men began to appear at the edges of the column, outlaws, brigands, dispossessed farmers, younger sons with no inheritance and nothing to lose. Some came for plunder, some came for revenge against the chieftains who had wronged them. A few came because they believed in the king's cause, or in the king himself. Olaf accepted them all, but with a condition that shocked even his most loyal followers. He demanded that every pagan in his ranks accept baptism before they crossed into Norway. Those who refused were dismissed with a silver coin and a blessing. Those who accepted were led to the cold streams that tumbled down from the mountains, where priests spoke the Latin words and poured the icy water over their heads. The good knight watched dozens of men walk away rather than accept the Christian God. He watched the army shrink from perhaps 800 to barely 3,000. And he understood, with the clarity of long experience, that the king was not trying to build an army. He was building a congregation. Every man who crossed into Norway would do so as a soldier of Christ, whether he believed it in his heart or not. If they died, they would die as martyrs. If they won, they would win as crusaders. It was brilliant and terrible in equal measure. They crossed the Kjolund Mountains in late July. The good knight had crossed those peaks before, in the other direction, fleeing into exile. Now he was returning, and the mountains seemed to watch their passage with the patient indifference of stone. The air grew thinner. The wind carried the smell of snow even in summer, and then, quite suddenly, they crested a ridge, and Norway lay before them. The valley of Verdal spread below like a green tapestry, the farms and fields arranged in neat patterns along the river. It looked peaceful. It looked like home. The good knight felt something twist in his chest. Not quite hope, not quite dread. Something in between. They descended into the valley, and the reception was immediate and hostile. Signal fires blazed on the hilltops, the ancient warning system of the Norse, each fire visible to the next, spreading the alarm faster than any rider. The king has returned. The king has returned. Arm yourselves. Gather the levy. The king has returned. As they marched through the valley, the army trampled the ripening grain in the fields of a farm called Sol. The good knight saw the farmer standing at the edge of his ruined crop, his face twisted with rage and grief. The man shouted curses at them, called them thieves and brigands, spat on the ground as the king's banner passed. Other farmers joined him, their voices rising in a chorus of hatred. The good knight had fought in many lands, had seen many peoples, but he had never before been part of an army that was hated by the very people it claimed to liberate. It was a strange, sickening feeling, like wearing armor that was too tight, that constricted the breath and made every movement awkward. King Olaf, riding at the head of the column, seemed not to notice. Or perhaps he noticed and did not care. His face was serene, almost peaceful. He looked like a man who had already made his peace with death and was simply waiting for it to arrive. That night, they camped in the valley. The good knight stood watch in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the peasant army gathering. He could hear the horns calling the levy, the shouts of men organizing themselves, the clatter of weapons being distributed. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, thousands of Norwegian farmers were preparing to kill their king. The good knight checked his equipment with the methodical care of long practice. His mail shirt was clean, the rings oiled and flexible. His helmet sat snug on his head, the nasal guard protecting his face. His shield was freshly painted with a white cross, the king's order so that Christian could distinguish Christian in the chaos of battle. His sword, the blade that had been his companion for more years than he cared to count, hung at his side. The leather grip was worn smooth by his hand, shaped to his palm like a lover's touch. He was ready. He had been ready for centuries. But as he stood in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the enemy army gathering, he wondered if readiness mattered. He wondered if anything mattered in the face of what was coming. In the king's tent, Olaf was praying. The good knight could see the flicker of candlelight through the canvas, could hear the low murmur of Latin words. The king was preparing his soul for the journey ahead. The good knight wished he had that kind of faith, that certainty of purpose. But he was a warrior, not a saint. All he had was his oath, his sword, and the knowledge that when the sun rose, he would stand in the shield wall and do what he had always done. He would fight. He would endure. And if the gods, or God, were merciful, he would survive. Chapter 2. The gathering storm. Dawn came slowly to the valley of Verdal, the sun climbing reluctantly over the eastern ridges as if it too dreaded what the day would bring. The good knight had not slept. Few in the camp had. The night had been filled with the sounds of preparation. The rasp of whetstones on blades, the creak of leather being adjusted, the low murmur of men speaking to their gods or their memories. The king emerged from his tent as the first light touched the valley. He was already armored, his mail shirt gleaming dully in the grey dawn, his helmet under his arm. He looked smaller somehow, more human, without the trappings of kingship around him. Just a man in his mid-30s, his beard showing the first threads of grey, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and the weight of impossible choices. But when he raised his voice to address the army, there was no weakness in it. It carried across the camp with the clarity of a church bell, and men stopped what they were doing to listen. "Today," Olaf said, "we will meet our countrymen in battle, our brothers, our kinsmen, men who speak our language and worship our God, or who will, before this day is done." He paused, letting the words settle. The good knight saw men shifting uncomfortably. This was the great unspoken horror of civil war, that the enemy wore a familiar face. "I will not lie to you," the king continued. "They outnumber us, perhaps 2 to 1, perhaps 3 to 1. The chieftains have called out the full levy, every able-bodied man from Trøndelag and beyond. They hold the high ground. They know this land better than we do. By every measure of military science, we should not win this battle." A ripple of unease passed through the ranks. The good knight saw some of the newer recruits, the outlaws and opportunists who had joined in Sweden, glancing toward the tree line, calculating their chances of slipping away. "But," Olaf said, and his voice hardened like iron cooling in water, "we do not fight by the measures of military science. We fight by the measure of faith. Every man here has been baptized in Christ's name. Every man here carries the cross on his shield. When we die, and some of us will die, we will not descend into the darkness of hell or wander the grey shores of Niflheim. We will be raised up. We will sit at the table of the Lord in a kingdom that does not end." The good knight felt the words wash over him. He had heard many battle speeches in his long life. Some had been crude appeals to greed, promising plunder and slaves. Some had been sophisticated invocations of honor and glory. But this was different. Olaf was not promising victory. He was promising transcendence. He was telling his men that losing was winning, that death was life, that defeat was triumph. It was insane. It was brilliant. And the good knight could see it working. The men were straightening, their faces hardening with resolve. They were no longer an army of exiles and outlaws. They were becoming something else. Something dangerous. "Paint your shields," Olaf commanded. "Mark yourselves as soldiers of Christ, and when the lines meet, remember, we do not fight for land or silver or revenge. We fight for the soul of Norway itself. Forward, forward, Christian men! Forward, men of the cross! Fram, Christsmen! Crossmen!" The cry was taken up by the herd, the professional warriors who formed the core of the army. The good knight added his voice to theirs, feeling the old familiar tightening in his chest that came before battle. Fear and excitement mixed together until they were indistinguishable, a cocktail that sharpened the senses and made the world seem preternaturally clear. They broke camp quickly, efficiently. The good knight moved through the familiar rituals of preparation. He checked his mail one final time, running his fingers over the rings, feeling for any that might be loose or damaged. He adjusted his sword belt, making sure the blade would draw smoothly. He hefted his shield, testing its weight and balance. The white cross painted on its face was still wet, the paint gleaming in the morning light. Around him, the army was forming up. The king's banner, a white serpent on a red field, was raised at the center of the line. The hired, perhaps 400 strong, formed around it. These were the veterans, the men who had followed Olaf through exile and back again. The GoodKnight took his place among them, shoulder to shoulder with men he had fought beside for years. To his left was Finn Arneson, a grizzled warrior whose face was a map of old scars. To his right was a younger man, barely 20, whose name the GoodKnight had never learned. The boy's hands were shaking as he gripped his spear. "First battle?" the GoodKnight asked quietly. The boy nodded, not trusting his voice. "Stay close to the man on your right. Keep your shield up. Don't try to be a hero. Just survive the first few minutes, and your body will remember what to do." The boy nodded again, swallowing hard. The GoodKnight wondered if he would live to see sunset. Probably not. The young ones rarely did in their first real battle. They were too eager, too reckless, too convinced of their own immortality. The ones who survived learned caution, learned to read the flow of combat, to know when to press forward and when to give ground. But that knowledge came at a price, paid in blood and screaming and the faces of dead friends. On the flanks, the Swedish auxiliaries and the irregular levies were forming up. They looked less confident than the hired, their formations looser, their equipment more varied. Some had proper mail and helmets. Others wore only leather jerkins and carried axes that looked like they had been farm tools the day before, which, the GoodKnight reflected, they probably had been. And then, as the sun climbed higher, they saw the enemy. The peasant army was arrayed on the slopes of Stiklestad farm, perhaps half a mile distant. Even from this distance, the GoodKnight could see that the reports had not been exaggerated. There were thousands of them. The shield wall stretched across the entire width of the valley, a solid line of wood and iron and angry men. Their shields were painted with the old symbols, ravens and wolves and the hammer of Thor, mixed with Christian crosses. A visible reminder that Norway was a land caught between two faiths, two worlds, two visions of what it meant to be Norwegian. Above the peasant line, their banners snapped in the morning breeze. The GoodKnight recognized some of them: the raven banner of Horek of Tjotta, the wolf's head of Tore Hund, and there, in the center, the personal standard of Kalv Arneson, a man who had once been Olaf's friend, who had fought at the king's side, who had accepted the king's gifts and sworn the king's oaths, and who had sold all of that for Danish silver. The sight of Kalv's banner made something cold and hard settle in the GoodKnight's stomach. Betrayal was an old story, as old as warfare itself. But it never stopped hurting. It never stopped feeling like a personal wound, even when the betrayed was someone else. Before the lines advanced, King Olaf called for Thormod Kolbrunarskald, the court poet. Thormod was a lean, weathered man with the far-seeing eyes of a skald and the scarred hands of a warrior. He had been with Olaf since the beginning, had composed verses celebrating the king's victories and mourning his defeats. Now, as the army waited in the shadow of the coming battle, Olaf asked him to recite. "Give them the Bjarkamal," the king said. The GoodKnight felt a shiver run down his spine. The Bjarkamal was an ancient poem, older than Christianity, older perhaps than the settlement of Norway itself. It told the story of King Rolf Kraki and his champions, who had died to the last man defending their lord's hall against overwhelming odds. It was a poem about loyalty unto death, about the warrior's code that transcended survival, about the beauty and terror of the last stand. It was also, unmistakably, a pagan poem. For Olaf to call for it now, on the eve of a battle he framed as a kikkorster, Christian crusade, was a strange and powerful choice. It was an acknowledgement that the old ways still had power, still spoke to something deep in the Norse soul. It was a bridge between the world that was dying and the world being born. Thormod's voice rose clear and strong, the old Norse words rolling out across the assembled army. Day has come. The cock's wings clatter. Time for thralls to turn to labour. Wake now. Wake, my warrior friends, all you best of Eddil's benchmates. The GoodKnight closed his eyes and let the words wash over him. He had heard the Bjarkamal before, many times, in many halls, but never like this. Never standing in a shield wall, waiting for the order to advance, knowing that the poem's ending, the death of every hero, the burning of the hall, the triumph of fate over courage, might be his own ending as well. When Thormod finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then, from somewhere in the ranks, a man began to weep. Not from fear, the GoodKnight thought, but from the terrible beauty of it all. From the knowledge that they were living inside a saga, that their deaths would be remembered and sung, that they were part of something larger than themselves. King Olaf raised his sword. The blade caught the sunlight, flashing like a signal fire. "Forward!" he shouted. "In the name of Christ and Norway! Forward!" The army began to move. The GoodKnight had been in enough battles to know that the advance was always the strangest part. The world seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. Each step felt both endless and instantaneous. The distance to the enemy line seemed to stretch and compress like something alevsirad, something that played tricks with perception and time. His breathing was steady, controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth. His heart was pounding, but not with panic, with readiness. His body knew what was coming, had known it for centuries. The muscles remembered the weight of the shield, the balance of the sword, the rhythm of combat. Around him, the herd maintained their formation. Shield overlapping shield, each man protecting the man to his left, the whole line moving as a single organism. Behind them, the less experienced troops struggled to keep up, their formations ragged, their steps uncertain. The peasant army waited. They had the advantage of position, standing on the slope, forcing Olaf's men to attack uphill. It was a good defensive position. A smart commander would have held it, let the enemy exhaust themselves in the advance, then counterattacked when they were winded and disorganized. But the GoodKnight could see movement in the peasant line. They were not going to wait. They were coming down to meet the attack. The distance closed. 500 yards, 400, 300. The GoodKnight could see individual faces now. A man with a grey beard and a dented helmet. A boy who looked even younger than the one standing to the GoodKnight's right. A farmer with arms like tree trunks and an axe that could split a man from shoulder to hip. 200 yards. The peasant army began to chant. "Fram, bondemen! Forward, forward, farmers!" The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, thousands of voices united in defiance and rage. 100 yards. The GoodKnight lowered his shield, bracing it against his shoulder. He drew his sword, the familiar weight of it settling into his hand like a prayer. 50 yards. He could smell them now. Sweat and leather and the sharp tang of fear. Could see the whites of their eyes, the tension in their shoulders, the way their shields trembled slightly despite their best efforts to hold them steady. 20 yards. King Olaf's voice cut through the roar. "For Christ! For Norway! For the kingdom that does not end!" 10 yards. The GoodKnight filled his lungs and added his voice to the battle cry of the herd. "Fram Kristsman!" And then the lines met, and the world exploded into chaos. Chapter 3. The Storm of Swords. The impact of the shield walls colliding was like nothing else in human experience. It was not the clean clash of blade on blade that poets sang about. It was a massive, grinding, splintering crash, wood on wood, iron on iron, flesh on flesh, accompanied by a sound that was part roar, part scream, part prayer. The good knight felt the shock of it travel up his arm, through his shoulder, into his spine. The man in front of him, the grey-bearded farmer, slammed his shield into the good knight's with enough force to drive him back half a step. But only half a step. The good knight had planted his feet, had braced his weight, had done this 1,000 times before. He pushed back, hard, feeling the man on his right, and the man on his left doing the same. The shield wall held. For a moment, just a moment, the two lines were locked together, neither advancing nor retreating, just pushing, straining, every man trying to drive the enemy back through sheer force of will and muscle. The good knight could hear the man in front of him grunting with effort, could smell his breath, sour with fear and the morning's ale. Their shields were pressed so tightly together that the good knight could see the grain of the wood, could count the iron rivets that held the boss in place. Then the grey-bearded man made a mistake. He tried to pull his shield back just a few inches to create space for a sword thrust. It was a reasonable tactic. It might even have worked against a less experienced opponent. But the good knight had been waiting for exactly that opening. The instant the pressure on his shield lessened, he surged forward, slamming the iron boss into the man's face. He felt the crunch of breaking bone, heard the man's scream cut short as blood filled his mouth. The farmer staggered backward, and the good knight's sword was already moving, a short, brutal thrust over the top of his shield, aimed at the gap between the man's helmet and his mail collar. The blade found flesh. The farmer went down, and the good knight was already stepping over him, pressing into the gap he had created, his shield up, his sword seeking the next target. This was the reality of shield wall combat. It was not glorious. It was not beautiful. It was butcher's work, performed in a space so confined that men could barely swing their weapons. Most of the killing was done with short thrusts and stabs, aimed at the vulnerable points, the throat, the armpit, the groin, the face. A man could be a master swordsman, could know 100 techniques and flourishes, and none of it mattered in the crush of the shield wall. What mattered was strength, endurance, and the willingness to keep pushing forward when every instinct screamed to run. The good knight pushed forward. Around him, the hired was doing the same. These were professional warriors, men who had trained together, fought together, bled together. They moved as a unit, each man supporting the others, the whole line advancing like a steel wedge driven into wood. The peasant line, for all its numbers, was beginning to buckle. The good knight caught a glimpse of King Olaf, perhaps 10 yards to his left, fighting beneath his banner. The king was wielding his sword, Hneitr, the striker, with the skill of a man who had spent his life at war. The blade rose and fell, each stroke precise and economical. Men fell before him, and the white serpent banner advanced. For a moment, just a moment, the good knight allowed himself to hope. They were winning. Against all odds, against all reason, they were actually winning. The peasant center was bending backward, curving like a bow under tension. If they could just maintain the pressure, if they could just keep pushing, the line would break. And once it broke, once the peasants began to run, the battle would be over. But then the good knight's peripheral vision caught movement on the flanks, and the hope died. The peasant wings were not breaking. They were advancing. The Swedish auxiliaries and irregular levies on Olaf's flanks, facing the full weight of the peasant army's superior numbers, were being pushed back. Slowly at first, then faster. The good knight could see the formations beginning to dissolve, could see men starting to glance over their shoulders, looking for escape routes. The royalist army was being enveloped. They were fighting in a U shape now, taking pressure from 3 sides, and the peasant army, sensing victory, was pressing harder. The good knight felt the change in the battle's rhythm. The herd was still advancing in the center, but the advance was slowing. Men were having to turn to defend their flanks, breaking the cohesion of the shield wall. The tight, disciplined formation that had driven into the peasant line was beginning to fray. He killed another man, a young farmer with terror in his eyes and an axe in his hands. The axe came down in a clumsy overhead chop that the good knight caught on his shield. He felt the impact shiver through his arm, felt the wood of the shield crack slightly. But it held. His sword licked out, a quick thrust to the farmer's belly, just below the ribs. The man folded around the blade, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The good knight pulled the sword free and pushed the dying man aside. How many had he killed today? 5? 10? He had lost count. They all blurred together, faces twisted with fear or rage or pain, bodies falling, blood soaking into the trampled grass. The good knight felt nothing, not satisfaction, not remorse, not even the savage joy that some warriors claimed to feel in battle. Just a cold, mechanical efficiency. This was his function. This was what he did. He killed, and he survived, and he moved on to the next fight. But even as he fought, even as his body went, through the ancient motions of combat, his mind was calculating. The battle was turning. The envelopment was nearly complete. Soon, very soon, the peasant army would close the circle entirely, and then it would just be a matter of time. The hired would be surrounded, outnumbered, ground down by sheer attrition. They would die, every one of them, unless something changed. And then King Olaf did something that was either brilliantly brave or suicidally foolish. The king saw what the good knight saw. He understood that the battle was slipping away, that his army was being destroyed piece by piece, and he decided to stake everything on a single desperate gamble. He would kill the enemy commanders. The good knight saw Olaf turn, saw him point his sword toward a knot of heavily armored men beneath a banner bearing a wolf's head. Torhund, the chieftain from Hålogaland, the man who had led the northern rebellion against Olaf's rule, who had refused to give up the old gods, who wore, according to rumor, a coat of reindeer skin that no blade could pierce. "With me!" Olaf shouted, and a dozen of the herd, including the good knight, turned to follow their king. They cut their way through the peasant line like a spear thrust into flesh. The good knight's world narrowed to a tunnel of violence. Shield, sword, step, shield, sword, step. Men appeared in front of him and died. He didn't see their faces anymore, didn't register them as individuals. They were just obstacles, problems to be solved with steel. And then, suddenly, they were through. They had broken into a small clearing in the chaos, a pocket of relative calm in the storm of battle. And there, perhaps 20 feet away, stood Tore Hund. The chieftain was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with a beard that fell to his chest and eyes that burned with the cold fire of the north. He wore no mail, just a long coat made of reindeer hide, the fur still on it, giving him the appearance of some ancient beast from the sagas. In his hands he held a spear, the blade dark with blood. King Olaf stepped forward, raising his sword. "Tore Hund!" he called. "Face me! Let us end this between us as men, not as butchers in a slaughterhouse!" Tore Hund smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "You want to end this, Olaf? You should have stayed in Russia. You should have stayed with your foreign friends and your foreign god. Norway doesn't want you." "Norway will have me," Olaf said quietly. "One way or another." He attacked. The good knight had seen King Olaf fight many times, but never like this. The king moved with a speed and ferocity that seemed almost inhuman, his sword a blur of silver light. Hneitir came down in a massive overhead blow, aimed at Tore Hund's shoulder, a strike that should have split the chieftain from collarbone to sternum. The blade struck the reindeer skin coat and bounced off. The good knight saw it with his own eyes and still could not quite believe it. The sword, a weapon that had cleaved through mail and bone and shield, struck the hide coat and rebounded as if it had hit stone. A puff of dust rose from the impact point, and Torahund staggered slightly from the force of the blow, but the coat was unmarked, uncut, intact. For a moment, everyone froze. King Olaf stared at his sword, at the coat, at Torahund. The chieftain's smile widened. "The Noaidi blessed this coat," Torahund said. "The Sami shamans sang over it for 3 days and 3 nights. Your Christian god has no power here, Olaf. This is still the land of the old gods, and they protect their own." The good knight's mind raced. Magic? Was it truly magic? Or was there a rational explanation? The hide dried and hardened to the consistency of boiled leather, layered and treated until it was as effective as mail. He had heard of such techniques, used by the steppe peoples of the East. But in the moment, with the battle raging around them and the king's sword useless against the chieftain's armor, the distinction between magic and technology seemed meaningless. What mattered was that Torahund was effectively invulnerable, and King Olaf was not. The chieftain lunged with his spear. Olaf got his shield up just in time, the spear point slamming, into the wood with enough force to punch through. The king twisted, trying to trap the spear, but Torahund was already pulling it back, already setting up for another thrust. The good knight started forward, intending to intervene, to put himself between the king and the chieftain. But before he could take more than a step, the peasant line surged forward, and he was fighting for his own life again. A man with an axe came at him from the left, another with a spear from the right. He blocked, parried, riposted, his body moving on instinct, while his mind screamed at him to get to the king, to protect the king, to do his duty. But he couldn't. The press of bodies was too thick, the chaos too complete. He caught glimpses of the duel. Olaf and Torahund circling each other, trading blows, the king's sword useless against the enchanted coat, the chieftain's spear seeking the gaps in the king's armor. And then other figures were closing in. Kalv Arnason, the traitor, his sword drawn. Torsten Knaresmed, a shipwright from Trondheim, wielding a woodsman's axe. They were going to kill the king. The good knight could see it happening, could see the trap closing, and there was nothing he could do. He was trapped in his own fight, surrounded by enemies, barely holding his own. He saw Thorstein's axe come down, saw it strike King Olaf just above the knee. The king's leg buckled, and he fell to one knee, leaning against a large stone. Blood poured from the wound, soaking into the earth. The good knight roared, a wordless sound of rage and despair. He killed the man in front of him with a savage thrust, shoved the body aside, tried to force his way toward the king. But it was too late. It was already too late. Torahund's spear came up, thrust forward with all the chieftain's strength, aimed at the gap between the king's mail shirt and his belt. The blade punched through cloth and flesh, driving deep into Olaf's abdomen. The king gasped, his hands going to the spear shaft. His sword fell from his grip, clattering on the stone. And then Kalv Arnason stepped forward, his face twisted with something that might have been grief or rage or triumph. The good knight couldn't tell. Kalv raised his sword and brought it down on the left side of King Olaf's neck, just below the helmet's edge. The blade bit deep. Blood sprayed, bright arterial red, painting the stone, the grass, the men standing nearby. King Olaf's body slumped forward, then toppled sideways, coming to rest against the stone that would forever after be known as the Olafsteinen, Olaf's stone. The king was dead. For a moment the battle seemed to pause. The good knight stood frozen, his sword hanging loose in his hand, staring at the king's body. Around him, men stopped fighting, turned to look. The white serpent banner wavered, then began to fall as the man carrying it was cut down. And then the sky began to darken. Chapter 4: The Eclipse. At first, the good knight thought it was his vision failing, a consequence of exhaustion or blood loss or shock. The world seemed to be dimming, the bright summer sunlight fading as if a cloud had passed over the sun. But there were no clouds. The sky had been clear all morning, a perfect blue vault stretching from horizon to horizon. And yet, the light was failing. Men began to notice. The fighting slowed, then stopped entirely as warriors on both sides looked up, their faces turning toward the sun. The good knight looked up as well, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The sun was being devoured. A black circle was eating into the bright disk, taking bite after bite, like some cosmic wolf fulfilling the ancient prophecy of Ragnarok. The light took on a strange, sickly quality, not the warm gold of summer, but a cold, grey-green luminescence that made everything look unreal, like a landscape from a fever dream. The temperature dropped. The good knight could feel it, a sudden chill that raised goosebumps on his arms, despite the mail and the exertion of battle. Around him, men were beginning to panic. Some dropped their weapons. Others fell to their knees, praying to Christ, to Odin, to whatever god they thought might save them from the end of the world. "It's a sign!" someone shouted. "God is angry! We've killed the king, and God is angry!" The cry was taken up by others. "We've killed the Lord's anointed! We've murdered a Christian king! God will punish us!" The good knight saw Calv Arneson standing over the king's body, his sword still in his hand, his face gone white as snow. The traitor was staring at his blade, at the blood on it, and his expression was one of dawning horror. Whatever satisfaction he had felt in the moment of the kill was gone, replaced by a terror so profound it seemed to paralyze him. Torahund was backing away, his eyes fixed on the dying sun. The chieftain's face, which had been so confident, so triumphant, was now slack with fear. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The darknesses deepened. The black circle covered more and more of the sun, until only a thin crescent of light remained. The stars began to appear, impossibly bright against the darkened sky. Birds fell silent, the wind died, the world held its breath, held. And in that unnatural twilight, the good knight looked at the king's body and saw something that made his heart clench. Olaf's eyes were open. They stared up at the eclipsed sun with an expression of profound peace, as if he could see something beyond the darkness, something beautiful and terrible and true. His lips were slightly parted, and the good knight could have sworn, though he knew it was impossible, knew the king was dead, that he saw them move, forming words that no one would ever hear. The good knight tore his gaze away from the king and looked around at the battlefield. The peasant army was in disarray, men stumbling away from the king's body as if it were cursed, as if proximity to it might bring down divine wrath upon them. The royalist forces were in no better shape, scattered, leaderless, many of them wounded or dying, but they were still alive, and the battle, though lost, was not yet over. A hand grabbed the good knight's arm. He spun, sword rising, and found himself face to face with Finn Arneson, the grizzled warrior who had stood to his left in the shield wall. Finn's face was a mask of blood from a cut across his forehead, but his eyes were clear and focused. "We have to go," Finn said urgently. "Now, while they're still afraid. We have to get Harald out." Harald, the king's half-brother, the 15-year-old boy who had insisted on fighting, who had stood in the shield wall with the veterans. If he was still alive, he was the closest thing to a legitimate heir the royalist cause had. And if the peasants captured him, they would kill him, eclipse or no eclipse. "Where is he?" the good knight asked. "Last I saw, he was on the right flank, with Dag Ringson's men, but that was before—" Finn gestured helplessly at the darkened sky, at the chaos around them. The good knight nodded. "Then we find him. Gather anyone who can still fight. We're getting out of here." It was easier said than done. The royalist army had been shattered by the king's death and the eclipse. Men were scattered across the battlefield, some wounded, some in shock, some simply lost in the confusion. But the herd, the core of professional warriors, were still functional. They had been through too much, seen too much to be completely undone by celestial phenomena. They were afraid, yes, but they were also disciplined. The good knight and Finn moved through the chaos, calling out to the survivors, pulling them together into some semblance of a formation. They found perhaps 50 men who were still capable of fighting, still willing to follow orders. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. They found Harold Sigurdsson on the right flank, as Finn had said. The boy was alive, but barely. He had taken a sword cut to the neck, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to bleed profusely. He was being supported by 2 warriors, his face pale, his eyes glassy with shock. "Can he walk?" the good knight asked. "I can walk," Harold said, his voice weak but defiant. "I can fight." "You fought enough for one day," the good knight said. "Now you need to survive. Your brother is dead. That makes you the heir. If you die here, everything he fought for dies with you. Do you understand?" Harold's eyes focused on the good knight, and for a moment the boy's face hardened with a determination that was far older than his years. "I understand." "Good. Then let's move." But before they could take more than a few steps, a roar rose from the peasant lines. The good knight turned and saw a knot of warriors charging toward them, led by a man on horseback. It took him a moment to recognize the rider. Dag Ringsson, one of the king's kinsmen, a commander of the right flank. Dag was leading a counterattack. It was insane. It was suicidal. The battle was lost. The king was dead. The army was broken. Any rational commander would have ordered a retreat, would have tried to save as many men as possible. But Dag Ringsson was not interested in rationality. He was interested in vengeance. "For King Olaf!" Dag roared, his sword raised high. "For the king! For Norway!" The men with him took up the cry, and they slammed into the peasant line with the fury of the damned. The good knight watched in awe and horror as Dag's charge drove the peasants back, creating a gap in their formation. It was a masterpiece of desperate courage, a final blaze of defiance against the Ebtusjan, dying of the light. And it bought them time. "Go!" the good knight shouted to the men around Harold. "Get him to the trees! We'll cover you!" He didn't wait to see if they obeyed. He turned and ran toward Dag's position, Finn and a handful of others following. They hit the peasant flank just as Dag's charge was beginning to falter, adding their weight to the attack, driving the enemy back another few precious yards. The good knight fought in a haze of exhaustion and desperation. His arms felt like lead. His shield was cracked and splintered, barely holding together. His sword was notched and dulled from striking armor and bone. But he kept fighting, because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. He saw Dag Ringsson fall, pulled from his horse by a dozen hands, disappearing beneath a wave of peasant warriors. He saw Finn take a spear thrust to the chest, saw the old warrior's eyes go wide with surprise before he crumpled to the ground. He saw men he had fought beside, drunk with, laughed with, die in the mud and the blood and the unnatural twilight. And then, finally, the eclipse began to pass. The black circle started to slide away from the sun, and the light returned. slowly at first, then faster, until the world was bright again, the summer warmth flooding back, the stars fading from the sky. But the damage was done. The peasant army, shaken by the eclipse, was beginning to recover, and the royalist forces were spent. There was nothing left to give. "Fall back!" the good knight shouted. "Fall back to the trees!" The survivors, perhaps 30 men, all that remained of the king's herd, turned and ran. It was not a fighting retreat. It was a rout. They ran through the trampled fields, through the blood-soaked grass, toward the dark line of the forest that marked the edge of the valley. Behind them, the peasant army gave chase, but half-heartedly. They had won. They had killed the king. They had no stomach for pursuing broken men into the wilderness. The good knight ran until his lungs burned, until his legs threatened to give out, until the sounds of battle faded behind him, and the only thing he could hear was his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. He ran until he reached the trees, and then he kept running, deeper into the forest, away from the valley, away from the battlefield, away from the stone where King Olaf II Haraldsson had died. He ran until he couldn't run any more, and then he collapsed against a tree, his armor dragging him down, his sword falling from nerveless fingers. He sat there in the shadows, gasping for breath, and tried to process what had just happened. The king was dead. The army was destroyed. The cause was lost. And yet somehow he was still alive. Chapter 5. The long road. The good knight did not know how long he sat there, slumped against the tree, his body a collection of aches and pains and wounds he hadn't yet catalogued. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. The sun was moving across the sky. He could see shafts of light penetrating the forest canopy. But whether minutes or hours had passed, he couldn't say. Eventually, he became aware of voices. Low, cautious, speaking in Norwegian. He tensed, his hand reaching for his sword before he recognized one of the speakers. It was Rognvald Bruseson, another of the king's men, a warrior from Orkney who had followed Olaf into exile and back again. "Over here!" the good knight called, his voice hoarse. Rognvald appeared through the trees, leading a small group of survivors. The good knight counted them. 8 men, including Harald Sigurdsson. The boy was still pale, still bleeding from the neck wound, but he was on his feet and moving under his own power. "We thought you were dead," Rognvald said. "Not yet," the good knight replied. He forced himself to stand, using the tree for support. Every muscle in his body protested. "How many made it out?" "Maybe 40, scattered through the forest. We're trying to gather them, but it's slow going. The peasants are sending out patrols, looking for survivors." The good knight nodded. "We need to get out of Trøndelag. This whole region is hostile. We need to reach Sweden, or at least the border." "Agreed. But we can't move Harald far, not with that wound. He needs rest, medical attention." The good knight looked at the boy. Harald was leaning against a tree, his hand pressed to his neck, his face set in a grimace of pain. But his eyes were alert, watching the conversation. "I can make it," Harald said. "I'm not staying here." "You'll make it because we'll carry you if we have to," the good knight said. "You're the heir now. Your survival is more important than any of ours." Harald's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He understood the logic, even if he didn't like it. They moved through the forest in a loose column, staying off the main paths, avoiding any sign of habitation. The good knight took point, his senses alert for any sound of pursuit. Behind him, the survivors moved like ghosts, silent and exhausted. As they walked, the good knight's mind kept returning to the battle. To the moment when Olaf's sword had bounced off Thorahund's coat. To the eclipse, the darkness at noon, the terror on the faces of the men who had killed their king. To Olaf's open eyes, staring at the dying sun with that expression of peace. What had the king seen in that final moment? Had he seen the kingdom he had promised, the one that did not end? Or had he seen only darkness, the same darkness that claimed all men, king and peasant alike? The good knight didn't know. He suspected he would never know. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed on that battlefield, something more profound than the mere death of a king. The eclipse had felt like a punctuation mark, a cosmic acknowledgement that this was a moment of significance, a hinge upon which history would turn. They walked for 3 days, moving mostly at night, hiding during the day in caves or dense thickets. They lived on what they could forage: berries, roots, the occasional fish caught from a stream. The good knight's mail shirt, which he had worn for so long that it felt like a second skin, became a burden. The weight of it dragged at his shoulders, and the rings chafed against skin that was already raw from sweat and blood. But he didn't take it off. In hostile territory, armor was the difference, between life and death. On the 3rd night, they found a remote farmstead, far from any village, tucked into a narrow valley. The farmer was an old man, his wife long dead, his children grown and gone. He looked at the ragged band of warriors with a mixture of fear and pity. "You're Olaf's men," he said. It wasn't a question. The good knight nodded. "We need shelter, just for a night. We'll be gone by dawn." The old man was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from face to face, lingering on Harold's blood-stained bandage. Then he sighed and stepped aside. "Come in. But if anyone asks, I never saw you." They crowded into the small farmhouse, grateful for the warmth of the fire, the roof over their heads. The old man gave them what food he had: dried fish, hard bread, a little cheese. It was the first real meal the good knight had eaten since before the battle, and he devoured it with a hunger that surprised him. As they ate, the old man spoke. "They're saying the king is dead, that he fell at Stiklestad, and the sun went dark when he died." "It's true," Rögnvald said quietly. "We were there." The old man nodded slowly. "They're also saying other things. That when they washed his body, the water healed a blind man. That his blood cured a wound on Tore, Hund's hand. That he's working miracles, even in death." The good knight looked up sharply. "Who's saying this?" "Everyone. The story is spreading like wildfire. The peasants who killed him are terrified. They think they've murdered a saint, that God will punish them. Some of them are already talking about doing penance, about going on pilgrimage to atone for what they've done." The good knight exchanged glances with Rögnvald. If this was true, if the people were already beginning to see Olaf as a martyr, as a saint, then the king's death might not be the end of his cause. It might be the beginning of something else entirely. "Where is the body now?" the good knight asked. "They buried it in secret, in a sandbank by the river in Nidaros. The chieftains didn't want it to become a shrine, but people are already going there, leaving offerings, praying for miracles." The good knight sat back, his mind racing. The king had said, before the battle, that if they died, they would be raised to a higher kingdom. At the time, the good knight had thought he meant heaven, the Christian afterlife. But maybe Olaf had meant something more immediate, more tangible. Maybe he had understood that his death would accomplish what his life could not, the unification of Norway under a single faith, a single vision. It was a chilling thought, that a man could plan his own martyrdom, could orchestrate his death to achieve a political and religious goal. But the more the good knight thought about it, the more sense it made. Olaf had been a brilliant tactician. Why wouldn't he apply that same brilliance to the ultimate campaign, the campaign for his own sanctity? They left the farmstead before dawn, as promised. The old man gave them directions to the Swedish border, warned them about the patrols, wished them luck. The good knight thanked him and led the group back into the wilderness. It took another week to reach Sweden. A week of hard travel, of near misses with peasant patrols, of sleeping in the open and eating whatever they could find. Harald's wound became infected, and for 2 days they thought they would lose him. But the boy was tough, tougher than he looked. He survived, though the fever left him weak and hollow-eyed. When they finally crossed the border, when they finally reached the safety of King Anund's territory, the good knight felt something inside him unclench. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. But survival, he was learning, was not the same as victory. They had lost the battle. They had lost the king. They had lost everything they had fought for. Or had they? Chapter 6. The Transformation. The good knight spent the next year in Sweden, living in a kind of limbo. He was a warrior without a war, a sworn man without a lord. King Anund offered him a place in the Swedish court, but the good knight declined. He was Norwegian, and Norway, despite everything, was still his home. So he waited, and he listened. The stories coming out of Norway were extraordinary. The cult of Saint Olaf was growing with a speed that defied belief. The miracles were multiplying. The blind healed, the lame made to walk, the sick cured by touching the king's grave or praying in his name. The chieftains who had killed him were falling over themselves to recant, to do penance, to proclaim that they had been wrong, that Olaf had been a holy king unjustly murdered. Tore Hund, the man who had thrust the spear into Olaf's belly, went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and never returned. Some said he died on the road. Others said he entered a monastery, spending the rest of his life in prayer and fasting, trying to atone for his sin. Kalv Arneson, who had struck the death blow, became a broken man. He gave away his wealth, dressed in rags, wandered the countryside begging for forgiveness. The good knight heard that Kalv would stand outside churches, weeping, asking anyone who would listen to pray for his soul. And the rule of Knut's son Svein and his mother Eilfgifu, the Alviva era, was proving to be a disaster. They imposed harsh taxes, harsher than anything Olaf had ever demanded. They ignored the traditional rights of the chieftains, ruled with a foreign arrogance that made even Olaf's centralization seem benign by comparison. And then the harvests failed. Famine spread across the land. People began to whisper that the land itself was rejecting the foreign rulers, that Norway was cursed for killing its rightful king. In August of 1031, exactly 1 year after the battle, Bishop Grimkel, the same bishop who had supported Olaf's Christianization efforts, led a delegation to exhume the king's body from the sandbank where it had been buried. The good knight heard the story from a merchant who had been in Nidaros at the time. When they opened the coffin, the body was uncorrupted. The king's face was as fresh as if he had died that morning, with a healthy color to his cheeks. His hair and nails had grown, and when they moved the body, a sweet scent filled the air, the odor of sanctity that marked the truly holy. Bishop Grimkel declared Olaf a saint on the spot. The body was moved to St. Clement's Church in Nidaros, and within days, pilgrims were flooding the city. The shrine became the most important religious site in Scandinavia, drawing the faithful from as far away as Iceland and Greenland. The good knight listened to these stories with a mixture of awe and cynicism. He had been there. He had seen the king die. He had seen the blood, the mud, the chaos. He knew that Olaf had been a man, flawed, ambitious, sometimes cruel. The idea that this man was now a saint, that his death had somehow transformed him into a conduit for divine power seemed absurd. And yet he couldn't deny the evidence. The cult was real. The miracles, whether genuine or fabricated, were having a real effect. Norway was changing. The people who had rejected Olaf in life were embracing him in death. The centralization and Christianization that he had tried to impose by force were now being accepted voluntarily, out of devotion to his memory. The king had won, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of myth and memory and faith. He had lost the battle and won the war. In 1035, 5 years after Stiklestad, the Norwegian chieftains sent a delegation to Gardariki, to the court of Yaroslav the Wise. They came to ask for Magnus, Olaf's son, to return and take the throne. The boy was 10 years old, but he was the son of a saint, and that was enough. Magnus returned to Norway and was crowned king. The Yngling dynasty was restored. The era of the autonomous Jarls was over. Norway was, finally and irrevocably, a unified Christian kingdom. The GoodKnight returned to Norway with Magnus. He stood in the crowd at the coronation, watching the boy king receive the crown, and he thought about the man who had made it all possible. The man who had died on a stone in a muddy valley, who had been hacked to death by his own subjects, who had lost everything and gained everything in the same moment. He thought about the eclipse, the darkness, at noon, the terror on the faces of the men who had killed their king. He thought about Olaf's open eyes, staring at the dying sun with that expression of peace, and he understood finally what the king had seen. Olaf had seen the future. He had seen his own death, and he had seen what would come after. He had understood that sometimes, to win, you have to lose. That sometimes, the only way to unite a fractured kingdom is to become the thing that everyone can agree on, a martyr, a saint, a symbol. The GoodKnight visited the shrine in Nidaros, now housed in a grand cathedral that was being built over the king's grave. He stood before the silver reliquary that held Olaf's remains, and he bowed his head. He didn't pray. He had never been much for prayer, but he paid his respects, in his own way, to the man he had followed into exile and back again, to the man who had died so that his kingdom could live. "You won," the GoodKnight whispered. "You stubborn, brilliant bastard, you won." And then he turned and walked out of the cathedral into the bright Norwegian sunlight, ready for whatever came next. Chapter 7. The Legacy. Years passed. Decades. The GoodKnight continued his journey through time, as he always had, as he always would. He fought in other battles, served other lords, witnessed other turning points in history. But Stiklestad stayed with him, a memory that never quite faded, a scar on his soul that never quite healed. He watched as the cult of Saint Olaf spread across Scandinavia and beyond. Churches were dedicated to him. Prayers were said in his name. His feast day, July 29th, the traditional date of the battle, became one of the most important holidays in the Norwegian calendar. The Nidaros Cathedral became a pilgrimage site to rival Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, drawing thousands of the faithful every year. He watched as the story of the battle was transformed by the saga writers and the hagiographers. The messy, chaotic reality of Stiklestad, the mud and the blood and the terror, was polished into a heroic narrative. Olaf became a Christ-like figure, betrayed by his own people, martyred for his faith, rising from death to save his kingdom. The eclipse became a sign from God, a cosmic acknowledgement of the king's sanctity. The miracles multiplied in the telling, each one more spectacular than the last. The GoodKnight knew the truth. He had been there. He had seen the king die, had seen the fear and confusion and desperation. He knew that Olaf had been a man, not a god, and that his death had been as brutal and undignified as any other death on a medieval battlefield. But he also knew that the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story. What mattered was what people believed. And people believed that Olaf was a saint, that his death had meaning, that his sacrifice had redeemed Norway. And maybe, in a way, they were right. The good knight lived long enough to see the Norwegian coat of arms adopted, a golden lion rampant, holding an axe. The axe was the weapon that had killed the king, the instrument of his martyrdom. It had become a symbol of Norwegian identity, a reminder that even in death, even in defeat, there could be victory. He lived long enough to see the Reformation, when the cult of saints was suppressed and the relics were hidden or destroyed. The silver reliquary that had held Olaf's remains disappeared, lost to history. But the memory remained. The story remained. Saint Olaf remained, not as a physical presence, but as an idea, a symbol, a founding myth of the Norwegian nation. And the good knight understood, finally, the true lesson of Stiklestad. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about tactics or strategy or the strength of armies. It was about the power of narrative, the ability of a story to shape reality, to transform defeat into victory, death into life, a failed king into an eternal saint. Olaf had understood that. He had bet everything on it. And he had won. The good knight stood on the hill overlooking the valley of Verdal, centuries after the battle. The farm of Stiklestad was still there, though the buildings had been rebuilt many times. The stone where Olaf had died, the Olavsteinen, was still there, marked now with a cross and surrounded by a low fence. Pilgrims still came, even after all these years, to touch the stone and say a prayer. The good knight looked out over the valley, and he could almost see them. The two armies, the shield walls, the king in his silver mail, the eclipse darkening the sky. He could almost hear the clash of weapons, the screams of the dying, the battle cries in Old Norse. But it was just a memory now, just a story, just another chapter in the long, bloody history of humanity's endless wars. He turned away from the valley and began to walk. There were other battles to fight, other stories to witness, other moments when history would turn on the edge of a sword. But he would never forget Stiklestad. He would never forget the king who died to become a saint, the eclipse that froze warriors in terror, the moment when the Viking age died and the medieval world was born. He would carry that memory with him, always a reminder of the strange and terrible alchemy by which defeat becomes victory and death becomes eternal life. Epilogue. The Eternal King. In the year 2016, Norwegian archaeologists working beneath the floor of Nidaros Cathedral made a discovery. They found the remains of an altar, and beneath it a stone-lined chamber. The chamber was empty. The relics had been removed centuries ago, during the Reformation, but the structure itself was intact. It was the original shrine of Saint Olaf, the place where the king's body had rested for 500 years, where pilgrims had come to pray and seek miracles, where the cult that transformed Norway had been born. The discovery made headlines around the world. Scholars debated its significance. Tourists flocked to see it. The Norwegian government declared it a site of national importance. And somewhere, in the shadows of history, the good knight smiled. The king was still winning. Nearly 1,000 years after his death, Olaf was still shaping Norway, still commanding attention, still inspiring devotion. The man who had lost the battle had won the war, and his victory was so complete, so total, that it transcended time itself. The good knight had stood in the shield wall at Stiklestad. He had seen the king die. He had survived the rout, had fled into the forest, had lived to see the transformation of a failed tyrant into the eternal King of Norway. And he understood now what it all meant. History is not written by the victors, it is written by the storytellers. And the greatest victory is not to win the battle, but to win the story. King Olaf II Haraldsson had lost the Battle of Stiklestad, but he had won the story. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Our Good Knight will return. Subscribe for more.